Those 4 words stopped me from walking out the door of Terminal 3 and disappearing into London forever. I know what happened. She said them quietly, this small woman in a gray uniform with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and something about the way she said it made my legs go completely still. I'd been sitting on a bench outside a coffee shop at Heathrow for 3 hours by then, 16 years old, no passport, no phone, no ticket, watching thousands of strangers move through the terminal like water while I stayed frozen in the middle of it all. But let me go back to the moment I understood that my stepmother had planned this. Every detail, every minute, every move, and that the trip to Scotland was never about scattering my grandfather's ashes at all. My name is Claire. I'm 29 now. I run a small interior design firm in Portland, Oregon, and I have a life I genuinely love. But when I was 16, I was the invisible child in a house that had stopped being mine the day my father married Sandra. That was 8 years before London, when I was 8 years old and still small enough to believe that a new stepmother might mean a new beginning. I was wrong. My dad, Robert, was a quiet man, an engineer, the kind of person who communicated through actions more than words, who showed love by fixing things and showing up and leaving little notes in your lunch bag. He was attentive and steady and completely blind to what was happening right under his roof. Not because he didn't care. Because Sandra was very, very good at what she did. Sandra came with Tyler, her son from her first marriage. Tyler was 3 years older than me, which made him 11 when they moved in. From the first week, Tyler understood the assignment. He was charming in front of my dad, dismissive when my dad wasn't looking, and openly contemptuous when we were alone. He broke my things and blamed the dog. He told my dad I said things I never said. He had a gift for making me look difficult, dramatic, unreliable. Sandra reinforced every story, and my dad, who loved us all and wanted peace in his home, defaulted to believing his wife. I spent 8 years learning to shrink, keeping my voice down, not complaining when Tyler ate the dinner I'd cooked before I got to the table, not saying anything when Sandra signed Tyler up for every extracurricular and forgot to register me for the one thing I'd asked for. I told myself it wasn't malicious. I told myself they just had more history together, that blended families took time, that if I was patient and good and undemanding, eventually the balance would shift. It never did. My grandfather, my dad's father, was the one person in my life who made me feel real. Grandpa James lived in a small town outside Edinburgh, Scotland, and I only saw him once or twice a year, but those visits felt like breathing after a long time underwater. He was 81, sharp as a tack, and he had zero patience for anyone's nonsense. He called me his compass, said I always pointed true north even when everyone around me was spinning. I didn't fully understand what he meant. I thought it was just something grandfathers said. Grandpa James passed away in February, 8 months before the London trip. Heart failure, peaceful, in his own bed. He left behind a house in Edinburgh, a collection of antique maps, a small investment portfolio, and a will that no one had seen except his lawyer. The trip was presented as a memorial. Scatter his ashes at the loch he loved, visit his house one last time, say goodbye properly. Sandra organized everything. Flight from Portland to London, layover at Heathrow, connecting flight to Edinburgh. She handled all the documents, all the bookings. She said it would be good for us, healing, a chance to come together as a family. I believed her. I was 16, and I still believed things. The morning of the flight, Tyler offered to carry my backpack through security. He said I looked tired and that the bag was heavy and that he was just being helpful. Sandra nodded and said, "Wasn't that nice of him?" My passport was in that bag, my boarding pass. The $40 Grandpa James had mailed me for my last birthday in an envelope that smelled like his pipe tobacco. I handed it over without thinking. He was my stepbrother. We lived in the same house. Why wouldn't I trust him? I wish I could tell you there was some warning, some moment where instinct spoke and I listened. There wasn't. I was just a girl who wanted to believe the best about her family, which is not a flaw, even if it cost me. We landed at Heathrow after 11 hours. Our layover was 4 hours before the Edinburgh connection. Sandra said we should split up to stretch our legs. She and Tyler would find food on the upper level. I could browse the bookshop, she said, knowing I always gravitated toward bookshops, knowing exactly how to make me feel considered right before she stopped considering me at all. I spent 45 minutes in the bookshop. I found a photography book about Scottish landscapes and stood there flipping through images of the Highlands, thinking about Grandpa James, feeling that particular sadness that comes in waves after you lose someone. When I finally made my way back toward our gate, the departures board told me what my body already somehow knew. Edinburgh. Departed. 14 minutes ago. I ran to the gate. A woman in a blue uniform was already closing the door. I gave her my name. She checked her screen, checked again. Robert Mercer, boarded. Sandra Mercer, boarded. Tyler Mercer, boarded. Claire Mercer, no show. I stood there, and the world went completely silent. They had boarded. My father, my stepmother, and Tyler. All three of them had walked onto that plane and flown to Scotland. Without me, the gate agent was talking, asking if I was all right, asking for my passport, asking if there was someone she could call. I kept hearing the words and not processing them. My bag, I finally managed to say. Tyler had my bag. My passport was in my bag. She exchanged a look with a colleague. I recognized that look. It was the look of two professionals assessing a situation that had just become complicated. They brought me to a small welfare room just off the main terminal. White walls, a plastic table, 2 chairs, a box of tissues sitting in the center like a quiet acknowledgement of what this room was for. A man asked me questions. Name, age. Where was I from? Who was responsible for me? I answered everything in a flat, mechanical voice because something had gone numb inside me, and the numbness was actually a relief compared to what was underneath it. My dad. I needed to reach my dad. Whatever had happened, whatever confusion had led to this, my dad didn't know I was sitting in a room at Heathrow without a passport. He would fix this the second he knew. I was certain of that. He had to be. The welfare officer tried his number twice. Voicemail. Tried Sandra's number. Voicemail. The Edinburgh flight was still in the air. I sat with the box of tissues and thought about nothing because thinking led to the question I wasn't ready to answer. Why hadn't anyone noticed I wasn't at the gate? How do 3 adults board a plane without registering the absence of the 16-year-old they were traveling with? Eventually, they released me back into the terminal while they made more calls and contacted the airline. I wandered, past coffee shops and duty-free perfume counters and a newsstand where a man in a suit bought 3 newspapers without looking up. I found a bench near a window overlooking the tarmac and sat down. Gray London sky, planes moving slowly in and out. Everyone going somewhere. That was when I started to cry. Not the polite kind, the ugly, shaking kind that you can't stop once it starts. I pressed my hands over my mouth and tried to keep it contained, tried to be small and quiet the way I'd practiced my whole life, but it wasn't working. And then a shadow. I looked up. A woman was standing a few feet away, small and neat, silver-haired, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a lanyard that said Heathrow Passenger Welfare Services. She wasn't looking at me with pity, which is what most people did when they saw a crying teenager alone in an airport. She was looking at me with something more specific, recognition, almost. She sat down on the bench. Not too close. Left a careful space between us, like she understood that proximity was something I needed to choose. I know what happened, she said. And those 4 words, I cannot explain it, just unlocked something. Her name was Margaret. She'd worked passenger welfare at Heathrow for 19 years. She had a daughter she'd lost to a car accident 11 years ago, a daughter who had been 16. She said I reminded her of that girl in the way I was trying to disappear even while falling apart, and she said it so plainly and without performance that I believed her immediately. I told her everything. Tyler carrying my bag, the bookshop, the departures board, the welfare room, my father's voicemail. I told her about Sandra and the 8 years of being the one who didn't quite fit. I told her about Grandpa James and the memorial trip and how Sandra had organized every detail herself. And then I told her the thing I'd been turning over in the back of my mind since I sat down on this bench, the thing I'd been afraid to look at directly. 2 weeks before the trip, I'd come home from school to find Sandra on the phone in the kitchen. She hadn't heard me come in. She was speaking in a low, careful voice, and she said a name I recognized. Hargrove, which was the name of Grandpa James's solicitor in Edinburgh. I caught only one sentence clearly before she realized I was there and changed the subject with frightening speed. She said, "If the girl isn't present for the reading, can the distribution be challenged?" I hadn't known what to make of it. I'd filed it away somewhere uncertain, told myself I'd probably misunderstood. Margaret went very still when I said that. She leaned forward. "Say that again." I repeated it, word for word, because it had lodged in my memory exactly the way things do when you sense they matter before you understand why. Margaret stood up. She said, "Wait here." She said it with a quiet authority that made me believe she meant it and that waiting was the right thing to do. She was gone for 20 minutes. When she came back, she had a colleague with her, a younger man named David, and she had her tablet open to something I couldn't see yet. "We need to show you something," she said. Her voice was calm but had an edge in it now, the kind of edge that comes from controlled anger. The tablet showed security camera footage from inside Terminal 3. I recognized the angle. It was the corridor leading from the International Arrivals Hall toward the departure gates. The timestamp read 2 hours before the Edinburgh flight. Tyler appeared on the screen. He was carrying my bag, which I recognized by the faded patch on the front pocket. He walked quickly to a men's restroom. A minute later, he came out without the bag. He was carrying only his own backpack. He rejoined Sandra at a coffee counter 30 feet away. Sandra looked at her phone. Tyler said something. She nodded. She didn't look concerned. She didn't look around for me. She ordered a coffee and handed Tyler a cup, and they stood there for 4 minutes before walking toward the gate. Margaret swiped to another clip. Tyler at the gate, talking to a staff member. She zoomed in. His mouth was moving, and the agent was nodding and gesturing to something on the screen. Margaret's colleague had already spoken with that gate agent. Tyler had told her that Claire Mercer had decided to take a later flight, that it was a personal decision, already sorted with the family. The agent had no reason to doubt him. She'd marked me as a voluntary no-show and moved on. I watched my father board. He was looking at his phone. He walked through the jet bridge and he didn't look back, which maybe he wouldn't have done anyway, which maybe meant nothing on its own. But then Sandra followed, and right before Tyler stepped through, he turned and looked back at the terminal with a small, satisfied expression that I recognized. It was the same look he'd had every time he'd gotten away with something my whole life. I pressed my hand over my mouth because if I didn't, something was going to come out of me that I couldn't take back. Margaret sat across from me. She spoke carefully. She said that based on what I'd told her about the conversation I'd overheard and based on what the camera footage showed, Tyler had not made an impulsive decision. He had separated me from my travel documents deliberately. Sandra had known I wasn't at the gate. The question, Margaret said, was why. I already knew why. I just hadn't let myself say it yet. Grandpa James's will. The Edinburgh solicitor. If the girl isn't present for the reading, can the distribution be challenged? Grandpa James had been old, but he had not been vague. He was a man who planned things, who thought ahead, who left notes in my birthday cards about protecting what was mine. He'd said once, at dinner in his kitchen when I was 12, that a person's legacy was their last act of love and that he intended his to be worthy. I'd thought he was talking about the antique maps. Margaret made calls. The airline was contacted about recovering my backpack from the restroom where Tyler had left it. The Edinburgh police were notified. The solicitor's office was notified. And then Margaret's colleague reached my father's cell phone, which had finally come off airplane mode after landing. My father called the welfare office number directly. When I picked up, his voice was already wrong. Not the voice of a man learning there had been a mix-up. The voice of a man learning something that was making the floor disappear beneath him. Claire. His voice cracked on just my name. "Where were you?" I said. "Not where were you at the gate. Where were you this entire time?" There was a long pause. Sandra said you'd already boarded. She said you went ahead. I thought you were on the plane. He thought I was on the plane. Sandra had told him I boarded early. She'd said I'd gone ahead to find my seat. He'd assumed I was somewhere in the rows behind them with my headphones in, which honestly was something I did sometimes, and that was what made the lie so effective. It was built from something real. He hadn't known. That landed somewhere strange inside me. A relief and a grief at the same time, because my father hadn't watched me be left behind, but my father also hadn't noticed I was missing for the length of an entire flight. The Edinburgh police met the family at baggage claim. I found out the details over the next hour through Margaret, who had the kind of professional network that allowed her to know things quickly. My father was cooperative immediately. Sandra was not. She maintained that there had been a miscommunication. Tyler backed her up, but the gate agent had already given her statement. The restroom footage had already been retrieved. My backpack, found exactly where Margaret's colleague expected it to be, was recovered with my passport inside and Tyler's fingerprints on the zipper. The solicitor, a precise man named Mr. Hargrove, confirmed what I had started to piece together. Grandpa James's will stipulated that in order for any contested distribution to be reviewed, all named beneficiaries had to be present and legally represented at the initial reading. If I had missed that reading, especially under circumstances that could be framed as voluntary abandonment or instability, Sandra could petition to have my portion reviewed and potentially redirected. Tyler was not named in the will at all, but Sandra was, modestly, and she had clearly decided modest wasn't enough. What my grandfather had left me was not modest. I didn't know the full scope until later, but what Margaret told me, gently, was that Grandpa James had loved me in ways that showed up in documents as well as in words, and that whoever had advised Sandra to get me out of the picture before the reading had made a significant miscalculation. The Edinburgh police wanted a statement from me. The airline wanted a statement. The welfare team at Heathrow had already filed an official incident report. An emergency travel document was issued so I could continue to Scotland that same evening under escort. Before I left, I had one more call. Margaret handed me her phone and the screen showed my father's face. He was in a small room somewhere in the Edinburgh Airport, and he looked the way people look when something they thought was solid has turned out not to be. Sandra wasn't with him. He asked if I was all right. I said I was. He said he was sorry in the way that meant he understood the apology wasn't enough and was saying it anyway because there was nothing else to say yet. I looked at him for a long moment. This quiet man who had fixed things my whole life and had not fixed this, who had loved me and also let me become invisible, who was only now beginning to understand what the last 8 years had looked like from my side of the house. "I need you to actually see me," I said. "Not just look at me. See me." He put his hand over his face. He nodded. It wasn't forgiveness. It was an opening. The flight to Edinburgh was an hour. A welfare officer from Heathrow traveled with me, a younger woman named Priya, who bought me a sandwich from the cart and didn't ask me to talk if I didn't want to. I ate the sandwich and looked out the window and watched England turn to Scotland below me, the landscape going green and then wild and then unmistakably northern, and I thought about Grandpa James. He used to take me on walks around the loch when I visited. He talked about history and navigation and how before GPS, sailors relied on instruments that never lied. "A compass doesn't care about your feelings," he'd say. "It just points true north." He said some people were like that I was like that. I'd laughed and said I didn't feel like a compass. I felt like someone who was always lost. He'd said, "You're not lost, you just haven't found your north yet. But you will. And when you do, nobody will be able to pull you off course." I hadn't understood it then. I was beginning to now. My father met me at Edinburgh Airport. He was alone. He hugged me in the arrivals hall, and it was not a short hug. It was the kind that meant he had been standing there rehearsing everything he wanted to say and had decided a hug said more than any of it. Sandra was being questioned at a police station in the city. Tyler was with her. The questioning that night was preliminary, but the documentation Margaret's team had assembled, the security footage, the gate agent's statement, the recovered backpack, the overheard phone call I reported, and crucially, the text messages on Tyler's phone that Edinburgh police had requested access to, was thorough. I didn't see those text messages until later when Mr. Hargrove summarized them for the legal record. Tyler had sent a message to Sandra 3 days before the trip. "She hands the bag over every time. She trusts me. It's the easiest thing. By the time anyone figures it out, the reading will be done." Sandra had replied, "Make sure you're nowhere near the bag when they find it." Tyler had sent a laughing emoji. That was the part that took the longest to process. Not the practical calculation of it, but the casualness. The laughing emoji. I had lived in the same house as Tyler for 8 years. I had passed him in the hallway every morning. I had made him coffee once when he was sick because that was the kind of person I was, the kind who makes coffee for people who are sick even when those people are indifferent to them. And he had sent a laughing emoji about leaving me stranded in an airport in a foreign country. The will reading happened 2 days later. I was present. My father was present. Sandra was not. on the advice of her solicitor, though she had not yet been charged with anything at that point. The room was small and wood-paneled, and Mr. Hargrove read the document in a clear, deliberate voice, as if he understood that every word deserved its full weight. Grandpa James had left me the Edinburgh house, the investment portfolio, the antique map collection, a letter, written in his careful handwriting on cream paper, folded separately and passed to me after the legal portion was done. I read it alone, sitting in Mr. Hargrove's small conference room while my father waited in the hall. He wrote that he had watched me for years with the particular attention that old people have when they are no longer distracted by their own ambitions. He wrote that he had seen what happened in my father's house and that he had wished 100 times he could intervene more directly. He wrote that the best he could do was make sure that when the time came, no one could take from me what was mine. "You have always been my compass," he wrote. "You point true north when everyone around you is spinning. I could not fix what happened in that house, but I could make sure it did not follow you forever. By the time you read this, you will have already survived something. You always do. That is the thing about you, Claire. You bend, but you do not break. Never let anyone make you think that bending was weakness. It was the strongest thing you did. The house is yours. The maps are yours. Build something. I believe in you completely. All my love. Forever. Grandpa James." I sat with that letter for a long time. Sandra and Tyler returned to Portland before we did. The investigation in Scotland resulted in formal charges against Tyler for theft of travel documents and against Sandra as an accessory. The process took months, longer than I want to recount here, and the outcomes were imperfect in the way legal outcomes usually are. Tyler received a conviction that resulted in community service and a suspended sentence and a permanent record that followed him when he applied to the finance programs he'd been planning on. Sandra's charge was reduced after extensive negotiation by her lawyer, but the marriage to my father did not survive the discovery of her text messages, and I suspect that consequence hurt more than anything a court could assign. My father moved back to Portland. We started over. It was not simple and it was not fast, and there were conversations that hurt both of us and had to happen anyway, conversations about 8 years of not being fully seen. He listened better than I expected. He failed sometimes and then tried again, which is the most honest version of repair I know. I stayed at Grandpa James's house in Edinburgh for the summer after everything settled. Alone, for the first time in my life, in a space that was fully mine. I learned to cook Scottish things badly and then better. I read every book on his shelves. I walked around the loch in the early mornings when the water was still and the air was cold and sharp and completely clear. I thought about what it meant to point true north when everyone around you was spinning. The house is rented now to a family from Glasgow who send me photos every Christmas. I used the proceeds from the portfolio to finish my design degree and seed my business. The antique maps are framed throughout my Portland studio, and every one of them is a navigation instrument, a document of someone trying to find their way, which feels like exactly the right thing to surround myself with. Margaret and I still exchange emails. She retired from Heathrow last year and lives in Cornwall with her husband and a garden she says has gotten completely out of hand. She says she doesn't fully understand why she sat down next to me on that bench that afternoon, except that something told her to, and she has learned over 19 years to listen to that something. I told her once that I think her daughter sent her. She didn't argue. There is one thing I want to say before I finish, because I think it is the most important thing. If you are in a family where you are the one who shrinks, the one who accommodates, the one who has learned to be invisible because visibility only ever brought trouble, I want you to hear this from someone who was that person. Your smallness was not proof that you were small. It was proof that you were strong enough to survive until the world got bigger. You are someone's compass. You might not know whose yet. You might not even know your own north yet, but you point there already, even in the dark, even in an airport in a foreign city with nothing in your hands and no one coming. Hold on. The right person will sit down on that bench. And they will say, "I know what happened," and they will mean it.